Welcome, Professor Mark Denbeaux. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and interview with the Cambridge Journal of Law, Politics, and Art. You have dedicated an inspiring career as a practicing attorney, a professor of law at the Seton University School of Law, and as director of the Seton Law School Center for Policy Research. You are well known for your comprehensive reports on Guantanamo Bay detention camp and its operations. Today, we would like to concentrate this interview on your reports research on Guantanamo Bay. And my first question would be, can you briefly tell us why you became involved in the legal work on Guantanamo Bay, especially considering at the time of its opening, when the wider public was very supportive of the establishment?
Okay. I've always been a civil rights lawyer. It started in Selma, Alabama in 1965, and it kept going. And I've represented Black Panthers. I've done sex discrimination, various issues like that in criminal defense work. But my son came to me. He was also a lawyer. And Josh said to me, he said, "Dad, what do you think of Guantanamo?" And I said, I hadn't really thought much about it. This was right after the Supreme Court decision came down, giving the right to some kind of legal representation in Guantanamo. And he said, well, do you think they have the right guys there? And I said, I'm sure they've got some of the right guys, and I'm very sure they got some of the wrong guys. And it's the normal thing. They can't tell. And my son said, he was very fond of my father. He said, do you think Grandpa would have believed that Patton's Third Army could figure out who the good Germans were from the bad Germans? And I said, absolutely not. Dad would not have thought Patton had a clue who the good Germans were from the bad Germans. And then I said, but Josh, Dad wouldn't have cared either, because he didn't believe there were any good Germans. They had liberated two camps. And so Josh said, well, isn't that the point? I thought about it a little bit. Then he and I agreed that we ought to try to represent a couple people down there just to see if we could do what we normally do as lawyers, figure out what the cases are and who should be released and who should not. So Josh got me into it, and we joined a group of people who were talking about how to do it, other lawyers, and we went together. And at those meetings, they, among other things, referred names of people who wanted lawyers. And they gave Josh and myself, Josh and me, two. And there were two Tunisians. And this goes back 20 years, and I still feel like that's the beginning of a joke. I was given two Tunisians, but I can't figure out what follows from that. But we did represent them. We were given them because the belief was that they were a father and son. And therefore, they thought it would be nice for a father and son to represent a father and son. Well, they weren't father and sons. They didn't know each other. I would say that in a class difference, there was a big difference in many ways. But we represented them. And over the course of years, we got one out to Slovakia. And that was about 2009. And we went to Slovakia to see him. His name is Rafiq Alhami. And we went to Slovakia to see him, and he was quite grumpy. It turns out they had been released him to Slovakia, but he had been held in Slovakia in what was a former Soviet prison, which had been renovated so that it wasn't as harsh. There were sort of groups of people living together, and they had quite a bit of freedom. But we went to see him, and he said, I can't leave here for 2 years, and they're teaching me Slovakian. And I said, well, that's good. He said, can you think of a language that's less useful in the world today than somebody who knows how to speak Slovakian? And all I could think of was to say, well, now it opens you up to the whole world of Slovakian literature. And he was not very impressed with that. He was grumpy and unhappy. And the truth is, we had both Tunisians were released, and life was not good for either of them when they got out. The first one who was released, the one I was referring to, in Slovakia, Rafik Alhami's brother was a lawyer in Tunisia, and so was his sister, and he came from a fairly substantial social class. My other client, Lutfi bin Ali, was also a Tunisian, but he was not healthy. He'd had rheumatic fever as a child, and he had a rheumatic heart. And he left Tunisia when he was 19 to go to Italy, where he was an illegal, off the books, hiding, living on the streets, hand to mouth, various criminal activities, some for which he was captured, prosecuted. But he also had surgery on his heart there that helped him. He always wanted to go back to Italy. In fact, he wanted to go back to Italy to be a cook, a chef. He got taken to Guantanamo. Both of them were taken through the various routes. Both of them were tortured in Kabul, in the prison of darkness, which is a gross story. I can share it if you want. And although not at the same time, and they slowly got released. First Rafik to Slovakia, and then Lutfi to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was not a good place for Lutfi. The healthcare was no good. They were very hostile. He's also 6'8". And I didn't realize at the time that Kazakhstan is basically an ethnically Chinese country. He couldn't find any clothes that would fit him. In the wintertime, he couldn't get winter clothes. He had a very hard time. And after a lot of work, we had him moved to Mauritania, which was at least a Muslim country. Kazakhstan was only nominally Muslim. And Mauritania was much better, and he had a community there. And then sadly, 2 weeks before he was about to be returned to Tunisia, he dropped dead of his heart attack. He was a very witty, funny man. My wife enjoyed talking to him. We could use WhatsApp, and it was quite enjoyable, the conversations.
It really means that during your presentation of the clients, you actually built some boundaries with them. So you kept talking to them, and it's very impressive that you know their story. You were moving forward with them, like checking what is going on with them after they were released. And I would really encourage you to tell that story you mentioned in your conversation in detail if you want.
Before I get to that, I think I did bond with them, but I think most of the Guantanamo lawyers, if they stayed any length of time, we all bonded. In fact, there was nothing you could really do for your clients, except to some extent be a human being and have a relationship with them, because they had no other relationships. They were in really isolation, except for guards who were hostile to them. And as years went by, we got closer and closer. At the beginning, they weren't friendly. At the beginning, Rafik told me that he asked, what could I do? I said, well, I'm a lawyer, and the Supreme Court says that I can do various things for you. He said, how big is the Supreme Court's army? And of course, I had to say, well, they don't really have an army. And he was not impressed, therefore, with the Supreme Court. But over a period of time, I think I didn't help him very much as kept some human contact. We could send him books to read and do various things and develop some rapport. So the Rafik, I got a phone call about the prison of darkness. One of I think it was Human Rights Watch, called me up and said, your client, Rafik, was in the prison of darkness. And I said, what's the prison of darkness? Oh, he said, it's in Kabul, etc. And he didn't describe it to me then. And I said, so why are you telling me this? He said, well, we're trying to find out all of the people who were held in the prison of darkness. We know he was there, and we'd like to know when he was there. to fill in gaps. And I said, okay, but I don't believe he was because he's never told me this. And I've represented him for almost 5 years. He said, believe me, he was there. So Josh and I went down to talk to him. And it was fairly complicated time. And he wasn't that talkative. And finally, he came into the room. See, one of the things the detainees can do is say no to lawyers. It's one of the few things they can say no to. So they say, your lawyer has come here from New York City. They're here. They'd like to see you. And they can say, no, I'm not going to do it. And that would happen. And that was very difficult. You could go down there and maybe have no visits. It's a long trip. But the second part of our visits, he showed up. And I was in another meeting with our other client, Lutfi bin Ali, and I came in late. And I walked in, and my son, he seemed to enjoy this. Dad, don't say a word, sit down, sit there, and shut up. And I felt like he must have enjoyed that, but he was no longer 17, so there must be something going on. And Rafiq had said, I will tell you everything I know about the prison of darkness until you ask a single question. As soon as you ask a question, I will not tell you anymore. I had not heard that statement, so that's why Josh didn't want me to start asking my questions. The story Rafiq told was quite elaborate. And first of all, we said, Rafiq, why didn't you tell us about this? And Rafiq, over many years, we talked about it. And he said, well, you didn't ask. I said, Rafiq, I wouldn't know to ask about a prison of darkness in Kabul. Well, he said, you didn't ask. So he did tell us. And here's the story he told us the first time. And Lutfi confirmed it because they were there more or less overlapping, but didn't know it yet. Prison of Darkness was in the Kabul near the airport, sometimes called the Salt Pit. I don't quite know where that is in Kabul. Sometimes called Wazir. NPR in one of its actually found the location. There's a video on that describing it, and they've shown it on television. And NPR described it in a way that was not quite as vivid because it was already gone when they got there. But here's what it was. First, Rafiq's story, if you don't mind my digressing, because Rafiq was, in fact, also from Tunisia. He had gone to Germany, where he had been selling drugs, making money, and getting into problems, and he had stashed a lot of money away. And finally, a group of people came to him and said, look, you're being a bad Muslim. And they made arrangements to send him to Pakistan. And he went to Pakistan. And he then, while he was in Pakistan, the US started bombing Afghanistan after 9/11. The Pakistanis didn't want the Arabs there, so he was pushed into Afghanistan, ended up in Kabul. But when the US started bombing it, he had enough money, so he hired a guide to guide him through the mountains into Iran. As he said to me, that wasn't a great choice for a destination. But he paid a certain amount of money to be taken there, he said, and then his guide sold me to the Iranians for even more money than I paid. And he was held in 5 different Iranian prisons. And I asked him about Guantanamo. He said, there are many worse prisons. I've been in 5 worse prisons in Iran. And I said, well, how did you get to Kabul? And he said, well, what really happened was the US wanted all of us who were captured to be given to them. So the Iran gave us those many people that ended up in Guantanamo were actually handed over to Afghanistan, who then handed them over to the US. So officially, Iran was not intervening, but they were flown to Afghanistan by Iran. So he's brought in put in the prison of darkness. And here's how he describes it. He said, you go in a big building and it's loud noise, very few windows, people shouting, music, various things. And they take your clothes off and they move you into another room and they get all your clothes, everything off there. And then that room is really like a hallway. So the room, there's a door into the hallway that gives some light. When you close the door, there's no light in the hallway. So the door was open when he went in. They took his clothes off. Then he was naked. They then closed the door and then took him through another door into a smaller room, not a very small one, but to a smaller one. And while they took it in there, there was a bar 4 feet across from the floor in a room 5 feet tall. So you could not stand. But on the other hand, they also handcuffed your wrist to a pole and then went out into another dark room. They saw no light. Sometimes there was another person in the room, sometimes two, sometimes nobody. And they stayed there. Then after a while, they changed the other wrist. And then they do. Once they were in the room, they were made to stand up, as I've told you, with one hand, the other hand, or both hands hanging for an unknown amount of time because there were no clocks, no light, no calendars. They were naked. They were quite upset that there were no ways for any sanitation facilities. They would have to soil themselves, so they stopped eating, and they went through a very difficult time. Occasionally, they would be put against a wall with one hand in a ring up just above their head so they could sit and lean against it. And then sometimes they'd rotate hands. But he was here for about 6 weeks. And about once or twice a week, he would be taken out of the room naked. And Rafik described he was taken into a room to be interrogated with a woman interrogator speaking fluent English, an American woman, who was dressed, and he was standing there naked. And it was incredibly difficult for all of them to be naked, much less in front of women. And at one point, somebody said, lie down, we're going to shoot you. He said, I'll lie down, but why would you want to do that? And of course, they didn't shoot him, but it was part of them. And they brought him back. He was then, at some point, released and was then sent to the Bagram International Airport Prison. He was there when one of the detainees was killed. There's a documentary about it called Taxi to the Dark Side. And he was brought as a witness about what had happened to the person who was killed, but he didn't know anything. Well, I'm just telling you the kinds of things we learned from him. And I learned similar things from Lutfi bin Ali, but the picture is really the same. It's dark, cold, naked, no food, no ability to sit or stand for an unknown length of time.
Thank you very much for sharing. I think that really brings more of the prehistory towards what was the life of the detainees and how some of them appeared being in Guantanamo Bay. So, how do you think would you interpret the influence of international human rights laws and conventions on the legal framework governing the detention of individuals at Guantanamo Bay?
Well, I am a law professor, so I'd like to think I knew somehow law mattered here, but it's not easy to see where law mattered at all in any of this. Obviously, torture is illegal no matter what the Department of Justice says, and they tortured. I've actually represented 4 people, all of whom were tortured. 2 were held as high-value detainees, and all that really means is the CIA wanted permission to torture them, not because they were important. Both of the clients I'm talking about now, my Tunisians, were released. And in theory, they were supposed to be free to go. And one of the things that I've been interested in is how basically benign these individuals were. The truth is, they were a mixture of sort of people, some lost souls looking for something to do, some swept up at the wrong time in the wrong way. And the clients I had, the government admits, never committed any hostile acts against the US or its allies, but they were captured for a variety of reasons. Now, the real problem was America panicked. We were hysterical. We didn't know what to do. So when you do, you reach out and you say, we have to do something. And then they grab people, but they don't even know who they've caught. One of our reports concluded that 4% of the people held in Guantanamo were held because they were caught by the United States. 96% were turned over by warlords, tribal chieftains, local police in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other places. So the US never even knew what the evidence was against people because they were just being handed it over. When it comes to torture and interrogation, there are really three models of torture involved in this. The simple one is the Western world's view of interrogation, which is in the US, police and the FBI bring people in and they sit and almost always talk to them. And this is what's called, relationship building by the FBI. And so they will come in. They will bring people in to talk to them, but those people come in, they know a crime has been committed, they know where it was committed, they know things about it, and they have reasons to want to ask the person they're asking questions, and they have a pretty good focus on what they're trying to find, and they're pretty good at it. And much as I wouldn't admit it in court, they don't do a whole lot of physical abuse. Then you have military intelligence, which is really designed only to find out what's over the next hill. They want to have no ambushes and so on. And that works. Then we invented something that said, let's find out who are people who are bad people who don't like the United States. And that's all they were looking for because they didn't know what else to look for. So all of these people brought into Guantanamo were brought in by people who really didn't have know of any of the evidence because there wasn't any. And it's important to note that all the 773 people initially brought to Guantanamo, there's about 15 left. All the others have been released and there's been no problem. The single biggest indictment of Guantanamo is the fact that whenever people were released, they went back. Rafiq, when he was released, ended up in Tunisia and bought a used appliance store in Tunis. He was married and had a couple of kids and was running a used appliance store. All of them did that. Some became shepherds, some had businesses. Some people got in trouble, but not necessarily in any way related to this. So they had the wrong people in Guantanamo from the beginning. And so that made things difficult for everybody. But the problem we had with torture was once 9/11 happened, we decided that we needed to find out who are the people who don't like us and what are they planning to do to hurt us. And the problem was, first, the CIA were the ones trying to be the inquisitors, but they were humiliated by having missed 9/11. And they were desperate to prove how good they were and how clever they were. But their problem was how to get information out. And there were a lot of meetings in September and October about who they could target, what the debate was between the FBI and the CIA. And the question was, who was the target and how could they deal with it? And they all wanted to torture. And the problem is that everybody would like to have a magic bullet that will make people tell the truth and know it's true. And of course, nobody trusts anybody. So they end up feeling like they have to coerce. So the American model ended up saying, we've got to find some way to find out the truth. And as I've pointed out, The ancient Chinese tried to do that. The Romans tried to do that. Obviously, the Florentines tried to do that. The Russians have tried to do that. And it turns out that we can go through, the Nazis have tried to do that. And the one problem they have is it's not hard to make people talk. Everybody will talk. Al-Qaeda's rules were if you're caught, they're going to make you talk. Al-Qaeda admitted that. But of course, they really needed to feel like they were doing something magical, having missed the opportunity. So a lot of this was driven by the CIA's desperate desire to find a way to discover truths through a magic secret that no one else has ever been able to do. And so that was a big part of it.
Yeah, so we already started talking about the techniques of the torturing, and I would like to mention the Dr. Mitchell. Like he's mentioned, like the one who developed the list of enhanced interrogation techniques. And how do you think, like, what distinguishes the Dr. Mitchell as the significant figure behind the Guantanamo Bay torture regime, and what specific role did medical professionals serve in this context?
That's a lot of very good questions, but let me start with saying that it isn't the Guantanamo Bay torture. It's the torture program. Much of the torture was done before they got to Guantanamo. In fact, by the time people arrived in Guantanamo, the torture was virtually over. Now, Guantanamo would like you to believe they never tortured there, and they'd like you to believe it was never for any moment a dark site. But they were tortured there, and it was a dark site for a period of time, something that is not ever confirmed in any objective way, but all circumstantial evidence makes clear that was happening. It's clear Mitchell was in Guantanamo. But let's talk about Mitchell and the CIA, because the problem is Mitchell worked for the Air Force, and he worked for a program called JEPRA, which was helping retrieve downed pilots. And he had set up a program called Survive, Evade, Resist, Escape. So they were supposed to survive and then evade and then try to resist and escape. And resistance was avoiding interrogation. Mitchell was running that. But the thing that Mitchell was doing by that was he was teaching Americans how to resist being interrogated. But he was in the Air Force. And let me stop to make one point clear. All of the Mitchell activities that are relevant to torture began the weekend that Abu Zubaydah was captured. On March 27th, 2002, the night before he was captured, the CIA had a meeting with PowerPoints and descriptions of what was going to happen. And their key role was, one, they were going to be the only people interrogating. They specifically didn't want the military doing it or the FBI. And that's kind of shocking because the FBI knew how to interrogate. And ironically, the CIA didn't. The CIA is in foreign countries. You can't catch somebody, take them to jail, and ask them questions. Generally, the CIA buys spies or uses electronic materials and rarely interrogates. And when they did, it was like such as Vietnam, where they did terrible things that were also pointless. So the CIA actually hired Mitchell April 4th. It's quite a remarkable thing. On March 27th, we don't want the Defense Department involved or the FBI. By April 4th, they hired a former DOD person who was in charge of helping people resist interrogations. And the deputy director of the CIA at that time was asked why they did it. And he said, well, we were in uncharted waters and we needed help, which of course is pretty staggering if you realize the 3 days earlier, they were saying we don't want any help from anybody. And then they admit 4 days later, they didn't know how to do it. That may have been the first and maybe last truthful thing they said about any of this. But the techniques that he developed were really reverse engineering the SARE program. But if I'm not going too fast, I'd like to make an observation here. Most of the torture program after Abu Zubaydah was captured was a bureaucratic fight between the FBI and the CIA. And not enough has been made of this. But when Abu Zubaydah was captured, the CIA caught him. He was the first person the CIA ever caught in this area of the world. And they shot him, and he was almost dying. And the FBI agents were there, and they were actually the first people to interrogate him and talk to him, partly because they had some Arab-speaking agents, whereas Mitchell is anything but an Arab. So there was a good relationship in a desperately terrible health situation with Abu Zubaydah and the FBI. But the FBI, the CIA began to box out the FBI over and over and over again in a variety of ways. And the FBI was only around really when he was seriously injured and he needed some more attention from people he was more comfortable with. But what happened was he was being interrogated in April after he was captured, but most of the month he was very, very ill. And then in May, there was some. And then on June 2nd, the FBI quit and they pulled out. And one of the reasons that Mitchell and Jessen developed their techniques was obviously not because they knew it worked, because their techniques they knew were designed to keep people from talking, and they learned everybody would talk. So with their techniques, which became the enhanced interrogation techniques, which is torture, their techniques were in fact necessary, had two components. They had to be something so harsh that the FBI agents would not be able to use them, because the FBI is regulated by domestic law in the United States, anywhere in the world. So they needed techniques that were too horrific for the FBI to be able to use. Then once they got those permitted, then the CIA would be able to use them and the FBI would not. And so that part of the torture program is this dispute is crucial here. When the FBI pulled out on June 2nd, Abu Zubaydah was never interviewed again by the CIA or the FBI until he was tortured in early August. He was put in isolation in June until August 4th. Now, it's quite remarkable because the justification for torturing him was because he was well aware of imminent attacks on the United States, and therefore they needed to get the truth from him quickly. So they got that permission on August 4th, but of course 2 months had gone by when they never even asked him a question. So it's quite clear that the techniques were not designed to get information from him. And that's understandable because the FBI's reports of the interviews in April and May were he didn't know much. And the CIA, of course, eventually had to admit when the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence established certain facts, they had to admit Abu Zubaydah had never been in Al-Qaeda. He'd never run an Al-Qaeda camp. He'd committed no terrorist acts. He'd attacked no one. And however, he was the first one they caught. And they really needed permission to use these techniques, because if they didn't have permission from the Justice Department to use these techniques, then there was a very good chance the FBI agents would report them for using these techniques because they're crimes under American law. And actually, in late June and early July, the CIA was asking the Department of Justice to agree not to prosecute CIA agents for the acts they had already done. as well as the acts they were planning to do. So the CIA with Mitchell worked out a series of techniques that nobody could be permitted to use without the permission from the Department of Justice, and certainly the FBI could not. So there could be no competitors. Then all they needed to do was to convince people that these harsh techniques were very successful because they were able to get information out. And based on that, they put together a series of lies in which they claimed they had found things from Abu Zubaydah. And the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, in its mammoth report, in the 556 executive set pages, which cites Abu Zubaydah 1,100 times, made very clear nothing the CIA got, the FBI hadn't already got. So before they sent him in to be tortured, they knew everything there was to know. And my students ask me, the question they ask is this: how can it be that people wanted to invent a torture system to torture somebody who they knew didn't know anything and had no knowledge? And by the way, that question is the hardest question I ever have trying to publish our materials, because it's understandable why anybody, and certainly why Americans, would be so horrified to find out that they picked somebody who wasn't Al-Qaeda, wasn't a terrorist, and got permission to torture him in order to get information that the torturers knew he didn't have. And the answer was simple. They wanted permission to use these techniques on other people, and they wanted to be sure that the techniques they had used, they couldn't be prosecuted for crimes. And that's how the torture program began. And Mitchell really doesn't have a lot with Guantanamo. One of my discoveries going through research on Guantanamo was that really the terrible things were happening everywhere else in the world. Guantanamo couldn't be worse if you looked at it, but it turns out other places could be far worse.
Thank you for bringing up this perspective. I mean, this really brings a lot of sense of understanding how those enhanced interrogation techniques were created. And how would you perceive the psychological and emotional toll on the detainees' health in Guantanamo Bay? You previously told us that they were like thinking partly that it was not the worst prison, but still, it still wasn't the best condition they were kept in there.
That's because we're
And
talking about Guantanamo. The torture happened in, as the world knows, Poland's had to pay hundreds of thousands of euro because they allowed the US to torture people there. Lithuania is the same way. And countries that were not part of the covered by European Court of Human Rights, they are known to exist. But if there's no European Court of Human Rights, there's no place to go to sue. So first of all, the worst torture always happened outside of Guantanamo. They were the worst of the worst in Guantanamo were brought in September of 2006. All the harm had been done then. They were just badly tortured. I don't mean that held in isolation, chained so you can't walk. I've never seen my clients take a step. I only see them chained to the floor when I go in the room. I've never seen, and it's hard to measure how isolated it is. And when it's, let me just say this, obviously the torture we've described is horrific, but it was constant. I mean, for instance, they were held nude almost all the time in brightly lit white rooms. They were nude with loud music and air conditioning, and it was cold. And then intermittently, they would be sprayed with water. None of these things were approved by the Department of Justice. These were inventions of the young men thinking they could find a magic secret. Well, people should look at that, because that report, which includes not only 40 drawings by Abu Zubaydah, but his descriptions of each of them, The government probably wishes we hadn't been able to get them, but we did. And it's the history of what torture was, not the history of the program that was approved, because there was no connection. You think of waterboarding, there's 3 or 4 pictures in there when somebody had been drowning in wooden boxes, put underwater, held there so they could barely breathe, so much that they would have to urinate on themselves for such a long period of time. They would have all sorts of things. There were threats of anal rape. None of these things were approved by the Department of Justice. These are just people out there trying to find some new gimmick. And Mitchell and Jessen were there primarily, but of course there were other people as well, but we don't know their names. So Mitchell ran the whole thing. He's made, somebody said, at least $100 million off this project. The CIA was happy to pay him $100 million so they could control who were the interrogators, and they could be the ones that could determine what techniques could be used. And now the CIA is stuck, having totally failed to get any useful information, but having managed to have America, for the first time, officially and formally have created a torture program. And it is very difficult to absorb. And for 15 years, I've taught many, many students who don't believe it when they walk in. When they come out, they're shocked. And as they look at the details of it, your question is, what's the effect on them? Sleep. They don't sleep. Some have gastrointestinal problems. Some have headaches. Some simply have anger issues. It would be hard to imagine emotional and physical problems that they don't have. I mean, you can't just do that to people for 6 years or more and imagine this. Imagine 35-year-old people having broomsticks shoved near their butt, saying they're about to be raped and never knowing if it was really going to happen or not, while being chained to the floor with women watching, spraying water on them all the time, cold rooms. The trick of Mitchell's, and Jessen made money off it, but Mitchell was the guy running it. The trick of Mitchell's was called learned helplessness, which psychologists are aware of as a technique. It's not a rational technique in this context. He wanted to make them feel helpless so they couldn't resist telling the truth. And well, their problem was Abu Zubaydah had already told his truths over and over again, and they wanted to find more truths that didn't exist. But the learned helplessness really comes down to sleep deprivation. If you look at each of the torture techniques, where they're confined in a small box, where they're put in a little cage, where they're being sprayed with water, or people threatening anal rape, or being banged against walls and hit, all of the things they did, they were done consecutively and constantly. The first 17 days Abu Zubaydah was held, after the permission to torture him, they went through all of the techniques one after the other constantly. They didn't stop and ask him questions. You'd think they would do something, say, now will you talk? They didn't do that. They were just trying to break him so they could get him in a state where it would be easy to get him to talk. So for 17 days, 24 hours a day, they were doing this to him. So even what they got out of him would have been incoherent, irrational. And all of them agree they would easily have talked. None of them believed you could resist it. It's impossible. You can't resist somebody hurting you in some way of that nature. So how much harm did it cause? I wouldn't even want to mention, but it's I don't measure it. It's hideous.
How would then, was there any program to recover their mental health after they were being released, or there was nothing behind it?
Well, it couldn't have been a mental health program where they're in Guantanamo, because who would they be? The mental health professionals would be, at best, CIA people or military people, and they wouldn't have trusted them on a bet. So that would never be possible. But the second thing about it is, you know, it's when you think of what could happen on the outside, one of the problems is they're from so many different parts of the world. The languages are different. Their cultures are different. It doesn't matter whether they're Chechens or whether they are people picked up in South Africa, or it doesn't matter where. It would be hard to set up a system for treatment because each culture needs something different. There are good people who have paid attention to it. One person is named Dr. Jess Ganem. He's a psychologist and teaches at the University of San Francisco Medical School, a terrific medical school, who specializes in victims of torture. And I found him incredibly wise and thoughtful and informed. And he looks at the idea of torture not just from the point of view of this one incident, but because it happens in many different ways. So I don't know what to say about I don't see how anybody can recover from this. But you can get better, hopefully.
What is like, based on your experience, what were the primary legal and practical issues faced by attorneys presenting detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and how did you overcome this? You mentioned some of them, like the detainees had the right to refuse you on replying on some questions, but what were other challenges you were facing during the work there?
There's no legal challenges to talk about because there is no law in Guantanamo. They have a right to a habeas corpus lawyer, but people can't win habeas corpus cases because even if you win your case, the government can still prevent your client from being released to another country. So there's no victory possible. Everybody released from Guantanamo has been released to sort of political issues, some human rights organizations, countries wanting their citizens back, a variety of things like that. And so I just don't want a misunderstanding. Lawyers, nobody should believe the legal system helped get anybody out of Guantanamo. They may have helped them see lawyers, but the system didn't do anything, is it? The system as we understand it. Well, the problem is dealing with people who are so foreign to you. When I was going down there the first time, I remember telling somebody, I said, when you put a bunch of guys together in a room and they don't know each other, what do they talk about? And my friend said, well, we talk about politics. Okay, sports, sex, and religion. And I said, what else is there? I said, well, hell, I'm about to go meet a fundamentalist Muslim and I can't sit there and talk to him about religion. I can't tell him about politics. I don't think I'm going to be talking to him about sex. So maybe it's sports. And I don't even know what sports they have. And so we started not knowing anything. It turned out they were like everybody else. They wanted to talk about sports, politics, religion, and sex. It's the same. It's a universality that continues. But it was very hard to establish a relationship. They didn't think you could help them. And we couldn't. All we could end up doing was having a relationship with them. And slowly, with the State Department's help, you could find somebody to get out little by little by little. But the legal system doesn't get any credit for getting anybody out or for stopping torture.
Yeah, and to summarize on like the wider consequences, if any, how like the Guantanamo Bay had the like the consequences on the US in respect to the legal system.
I don't know if it's had any effect on the legal system. I don't know if any of probably the most useful things were human rights organizations trying to use political power, and lawyers who had some political power, and some of the group did, were quite effective at getting people out. I would have said sort of informal, low-key politics, conversation, talking about it would do it. It would be very hard to see how the legal system did it. And I think one of the problems is a lot of lawyers, it's damaged your belief in the system. I've come to conclude that every country, if it panics and gets scared, does stupid, crazy, and occasionally mean things. And America panicked, was scared, and after 9/11 did many, many, many horrible things, thinking it was a good idea. And panic, fear, and hysteria don't bring out the best in people. And every country, when they're cornered like that, will do that. And we did. And I don't know, but I do feel like slowly people are looking back saying, we sure don't want another Guantanamo. I think this kind of thing won't happen. But in World War II, we locked up Japanese people on the West Coast, and we say that'll never happen. There's always been something that'll never happen again because it's a pretty ugly world out there, and people just keep working. And the legal system works really well when the world and the system itself is going well. But when it gets all blown up, the legal system is no better at stopping this than anything else. But around the edges and when it's not in this crucial stage, it's very effective.
Based on the above, people mainly don't talk about Guantanamo Bay anymore. And how do we make everyday American citizens understand the history to ensure that tragic memory remains in the past and does not get repeated, not just by saying we don't want to happen this again, but something as a bigger action?
Well, we've been writing reports about Guantanamo and about torture. And they've got some attention. We've collected some data. People have been looking at them. There are PhD dissertations going through materials that have been collected. So I think there's a whole lot of facts out there that people are paying attention to. I don't know if it's enough, but it's significant. And I think all we can ever do is just try to get the truth out and help people learn. I don't think there's a silver bullet to keep America from doing terrible things if it's scared and attacked again either. But that's true of every country.
Thank you. And on the last note for today, with the evolving global security challenges in combating terrorism, governments will continue to interfere with fundamental human rights in the name of national security. And inevitably, this will go too far again, probably. There is scholarly discussion to remove the definition of terrorism as governments to readily use this crime to infringe on rights. Instead, we should be associated with other crimes. Do you agree with this? And is this the basis for justification in infringing humans?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, that's all a prediction, right? How do people react to terrible things? Maybe they'll react better. And obviously, when they react terribly, it's usually the government exercising power and authority and interfering with people's rights. So I think that's just the way it is. The important thing is to understand America might not have wanted to believe that we were that way too. But the important lesson for me is America is that way, the way everybody is that way. If you're scared enough, you'll react in a consistent way.